Welcome to your Digital Mentor podcast. I'm Alice Matimba. I'm from Welcome Connecting Science, and I'll be your host today. We'll have a conversation about entrepreneurship and innovation. This is going to be with our guests, Jenny Malloy from the UK, Douglas Sanyahumbi, who is currently in Malawi, and Simon Travers, whom I believe is currently in Ireland. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves shortly. But just to mention that this episode has been quite interesting to get people to come and talk to us. And I hope that the audiences will find this useful, particularly researchers who are wondering about what does entrepreneurship mean and what does it mean to be innovative and how do you actually translate that into products or some kind of business. So before we start, I'm going to ask each of you, Simon, Jenny, and Douglas, to tell us, the audiences, a little bit more about yourselves. So I'm just going to start with Douglas.
Thanks, Alice. Hi, everyone. My name is Douglas Sanyahumbi. I'm currently based in Malawi, and I'm working on several projects, mainly Rice University, Rice 360 Institute for Global Health, where I'm involved in supporting entrepreneurship and innovation activities at research institutions, both in Malawi and several other African countries in the region. I've been an innovation management professional for 15 years, mostly based in South Africa, Cape Town in South Africa.
Thank you. And Jenny?
Hi, nice to meet everybody. I'm Jenny Malloy. I'm a researcher based at the University of Cambridge, and my group looks at primarily enzyme manufacturing, but we're very interested in how you can bring open source technologies to bear on biotech problems. We work a lot with colleagues in Latin America and Africa, and I've started a number of nonprofits, one of which supports small scientist-owned businesses in Africa. Our pilot is in Cameroon to manufacture reagents for molecular biology locally. So a real interest in the sort of social entrepreneurship and innovation side of biotech.
Thank you. And Simon?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Simon Travers. I am CEO of a company called Hyrex Biosciences. Hyrex is a company that was spun out of my research group at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town in South Africa. And so we're a for-profit company that produces software for medical diagnostics, but we very much have a bent towards enabling access to diagnostics across the globe, and particularly to focus on enabling access in countries that historically wouldn't have had access to diagnostics.
Well, thank you and welcome, all of you. I'd like to just jump in here and start by saying, so when I was a researcher, doing a lot more research, our institutions always talked about, innovation, entrepreneurship and translation and all that stuff. And it's something that obviously just goes over our heads as researchers because one, we probably don't understand it. And two, even if we tried, we still don't understand it. And we don't know where to start. And we don't know how to look at what it means to translate, your research into products and so forth. And I'm pretty sure if I'd had more exposure to, that kind of information or learning, I might have had a different mindset. Because definitely, I come from Zimbabwe, and just like in a lot of, African countries, there are so many opportunities to translate a lot of the research. And yet we still lack the knowledge of how to do it. So I'm just going to start by perhaps having a bit of a clearer definition of what is innovation, what is entrepreneurship. And I'm just going to start with Doug. So what is innovation and how does this, what are these, this concept of innovation and how does it relate in the research field, in particular, obviously in biotech field, and particularly in the research context, different research contexts in Africa or Asia or, abroad?
Thanks, Alice. So I don't think you're as unaware of innovation as you think. I think there's just so many definitions out there of innovation. The idea really is to decide, what is your idea of or your accepted definition of innovation. I always talk about working definitions, given the numerous definitions out there. So my working definition for innovation is essentially the action or the process of taking new ideas or practices into the marketplace. And they could be in any form. They could be products, they could be services, or they could be processes. So that's essentially my simple definition of innovation.
Okay, all right. And Jenny, would you like to add, and also maybe in terms of the definition of entrepreneurship as well. How do these come together in research context?
Yeah, and I'd agree with Douglas's definition. I think as researchers, we're quite loose in our language. So we often kind of say innovation when we're talking about the invention step of kind of coming up with a new technology. And that innovation stage afterwards is, yeah, we'll talk about for the rest of this podcast, I'm sure. Very different. I know for me, entrepreneurship is sort of getting out there and doing something about moving that technology or that product along the pathway. And I think, there's many different types of entrepreneurs. There's not one single thing that defines entrepreneurs other than that they're getting stuff done. And I think there's kind of a lot of difference between talking about doing something and in principle having the business models and having the kind of other aspects and then really being on the ground and actually doing it. I mean, as I say, I'm executive director of a small not-for-profit, and it often requires a huge amount of just very, very dull work to just get stuff done. And that's the sort of side of, I think a lot of times, again, coming through the academic system, entrepreneurship is held up as kind of something that, one should aspire to and something, but it's actually ultimately just really, really, really hard work. And I think that's really the gap between kind of that sort of aspiration and then the people who are able to move stuff forward is that plus the opportunity. And I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time in this session talking about kind of the opportunities that you need. If you have the entrepreneurial kind of drive to get things forward, you need the environment as well. So for me, that's entrepreneurship is kind of having the intention and the kind of will to do it. But then you also need that enablement also and support.
Yeah, obviously there are quite a lot of businesses that have started up, a lot of startup, I guess, especially even in the UK, and probably a lot more happening nowadays in other parts of the world. And I just wanted, and actually was interested in that, like, what's that entrepreneurship mindset? What does that mean? And I'm just going to ask Simon, what do you feel that's what you had? Did you know you had this mindset?
No, I don't know what type of mindset I have even today. I think it's just a really, really strong determination to get something done. And the only way that it seems to get done is if you do it and you work really hard, and you can't see any other way of doing it. And I think I come from a historically academic background, so I followed the academic route of, PhD into postdoc into setting up my own group, and entrepreneurship and innovation was always a very foreign concept. And it was, almost like sometimes I think it was kind of thought of as the evil commercial world, whereas we're kind of true, purebred academics. And it's been a long journey for me to move from an academic into an entrepreneurship environment. But really for me, it's just keep doing it and keep working hard and just keeping the eye on the prize. And the prize for me is that our products get used at scale and we are a sustainable company. That for me is simply what we're doing.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure when you started up your company, you were working on a lot of things. And I'm curious to know how you would have decided that, okay, this is the idea to follow. This is the idea to translate and to put more time and resources into. How did you decide that? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing to do. And I think we've made, I think all entrepreneurs make mistakes along the way or focus on the wrong things. But for us, we founded our company on the principle of we know we have something that can make a difference. So let's focus on it making a difference. That was specifically in HIV drug resistance testing. And so we probably focused too much on the product of making it absolutely perfect. And I think that's probably a mistake that we made. You can launch a simpler version of a product and still get traction on it, but that's been a huge learning. But that was the kind of the central core of our focus, was focus on the product and make the product good. And at the same time, then we focused on users and who will use the product, and how do we get to those users, and focusing on those two things has been great, both in getting us off the ground and getting us to a point where we are starting to seriously scale the product. But also that experience enables us to kind of know, well, where else do we need to focus, or where else can we focus going forward? And so we've really moved on from we're a HIV company to we are it's software. So we're a platform company that can support a wide range of diagnostics. So we're playing a lot in the COVID space, in the variant genotyping, and that purely just came from, we built a HIV product, we then saw it could be applied as a platform, and we've now applied it as a platform. So like that sounds so clean and so simple. And there was so many avenues we followed on that journey, but really that's kind of the core around what we've built it upon.
Yeah, well, actually, I just want to spend a few more minutes on this and to hear the glossy story, the one that, people tell you all the good things about I just woke up and then I had this idea and then I did this and then it sounds so simple. So I want to hear the simple side of it. And maybe later we can talk about the challenges.
That's the simple glossy side. We had an idea, it's worked brilliantly and everything's great.
Yeah. So tell us more. How did it start? How did you get into this? Obviously, was it opportunistic, or did you actually have a idea we are going through with this? So just a few more minutes discussing that.
Yeah, of course. So I was growing up in the HIV pandemic, and I was removed from it, but I saw that the world was hugely affected by HIV. And just from an early age, I always wanted to be able to work in HIV and see how I could make a difference in HIV. So I did an undergrad degree in biotechnology, did a PhD in bioinformatics. So that was the PhD was in molecular evolution of HIV and molecular epidemiology in Malawi. And it was awesome. It was great work. But really what I wanted to be doing was making a difference. And I set up my research group in Ireland, and we were doing great academic work, but really it wasn't particularly applied work. It was work where I was getting a grant, we were doing the work, we were publishing the paper, we were moving the field forward. But the end of the paper was always, this potentially could be able to do something. It was never, this is now being applied into doing something. And for me, there was that burning desire to move a paper from this could be to this is. And, part of that was being based in Ireland. So I thought the opportunity arose to move to South Africa. So moved to South Africa and took up a position at the South African National Bioinformatics Institute, which is based at UWC, a university in Cape Town. And again, I thought, right, now I'm coming to South Africa, all of the heroes whose papers I used to read from the HIV research community in South Africa, I now have an opportunity to go and meet them. So I took basically the first 6 months of my position, I just traveled around South Africa, which sounds very glamorous, and met all of these researchers and really just wanted to understand how can what we are doing and how can my unique skill set, because at the time, bioinformatics was a relatively rare skill set, how can our skill set make a difference? And I came across the idea that at this time, next generation sequencing was just starting to kick off. You could use next generation sequencing to do low cost HIV drug resistance testing at scale. This would be awesome, because if you are somebody in the UK or the US and you're diagnosed with HIV, one of the first things a clinician will do is order a HIV drug resistance test, which looks at the sequence of the virus, looks for the presence or absence of mutations, and says, you're resistant to this drug, you're not resistant to this drug. If you're in a resource limited setting, you're put on the first line drugs and the hope is that they work. But the studies that are out there that say, as many as 16-20% of people who are put on treatment, their virus is already resistant to the drugs. So for me, this was a huge opportunity to be able to go, well, we can use this sequencing to be able to do low-cost drug resistance testing at scale. So this was all done in an academic environment. I took on PhD students. I built up a research group to be able to develop software that would essentially accurately analyze, interpret, and report HIV drug resistance testing at scale using next-generation sequencing. So that was all coming from an academic environment. And as far as I was concerned, with my academic hat on, was we were going to build it, we were going to publish the paper, people would read the paper, and suddenly, magically, everybody would use the product and we'd make a difference. And that would be that. Not how things happened. And I can tell you how we moved it from that product to where it is now. If you want, it'll take another minute or two if that would be of interest.
Yeah, that's okay. And then we can probably hear from Douglas as well, I think.
I don't, because this is where Douglas and me came together. And so, he might tell the story differently from me. But at that time, Douglas was heading up the technology transfer office in the university. And I was a very naive researcher. And he sent around an email saying, look, if you've produced a product or you've produced something, you really need to tell us. So I went over and I said, look, we've produced this thing that's going to enable low-cost HIV drug resistance testing. But don't worry, we're going to give it away for free and everyone's going to use it and the world's going to be great. And Doug at that point chimed in and said, no, you're not. And also, it's not yours. The university owns it. And so this was my first foray into the world of IP. And so it was probably a 2-year process for Doug and the technology transfer office to actually kind of teach me and teach the team about innovation and teach us about intellectual property and how we can move it towards the next steps of commercializing a product. And that eventually materialized into us spinning out a company, and then there was a process whereby the IP was assigned from the university into the company, and now we're a fully independent company out of the university. Again, that's the glossy version of the story, but that's essentially what happened.
So, and Douglas, what was your role in this?
Totally agree with Simon on how it happened. He turned up in the office, said he had this idea, great. I think our whole office thought it was a fantastic idea. Of course, until he said he's going to give it away for free and everybody's going to be happy. And then, of course, had to point out that the knowledge or the IP that he had created was actually owned by the university, and that the process of actually getting it to the people he wanted to benefit couldn't be free, because just the process of getting it to the people cost something. He had to go through a whole process to get it there. But I think we had a good starting point. Simon forgot to say that he's probably one of the most determined people when he decides on something. I think we also saw our role as the tech transfer office of being one of really trying to make it happen, rather than trying to, despite all the bad news that we gave him along the way, is really rather try to help him to get to where he needed to be. And at the time, I think Simon was very strongly. It'll be interesting to to talk to Simon more about how he's actually moved, this sort of mindset where it's all about the research and it's all about publications, getting it out there, to a mindset which says, there's a business to run, there's employees to pay, there is IP to manage, and there's fights to be had. And he's had a lot of fights around, how we set this up, who's in, who's out, how do we manage the IP. And so really our role as the tech transfer office was to try and walk through this journey with Simon. And I think there were definitely ups and downs when Simon thought we were probably out to get. And there were times when I'm sure he was grateful that we were around and supported him, helped him raise some of the initial grant funding that he needed to do just the next step. And then, of course, he went on to do the really role of raising the funding needed to actually create a company that can scale and deliver value to the beneficiaries. And again, when Simon came, he really wanted to focus his company and his offering on the communities that couldn't afford this. And so he needed to create a business that could, be attractive to both those who can't afford, the standard drug resistance testing, and also be able to be commercially viable. And I think his company has done an incredible job of doing that.
Wow, that's amazing. And, obviously we'll come back to hearing a little bit more. I just want to hear from Jenny and how you have been sort of like working or supporting, researchers, particularly obviously in the different settings that you're working, and what has been the motivation. And I'm just interested in also hearing more about, some of your success stories in, building up some of these small businesses in Latin America or in Africa.
So the motivation was really that I'm a molecular biologist by training, and my PhD was in genetic control of mosquitoes, specifically Aedes mosquitoes, the dengue vector. And I just realized through that work kind of the extent of the inequity in terms of access to research resources between kind of myself here in the UK at the time at the University of Oxford and kind of other scientists working on similar issues in lower resource labs. And so that kind of stuck with me for a long time. It's parallel to that, I was doing some work with the Open Knowledge Foundation, who were looking at open access and open data in research, which at that time was really just becoming a bigger thing and being built into policies. And sort of the two came together when I got introduced to a few people who were developing instrumentation for biotech and for other sciences that was also shared openly. So I totally agree with the points made by Douglas and Simon that intellectual property is an extremely important and valuable tool for taking innovation forward. My argument is, though, that sometimes there's not quite enough nuance in terms of how we're not given access to the full toolbox of intellectual property. Often there's sort of a either give it away completely for free with no requirement or patent. And I think there's a lot of reasons people patent an invention and then make it available. For example, there's a lot of different kind of tools you can bring to bear. So I was interested in kind of how we take this sort of open source or more open licensing approach to some of these inventions and some of these kind of reformulations of hardware. So, you know, people were producing open source microscopes and kind of 3D printable labware and also recipes for making biological reagents. And I kind of got into the field of synthetic biology, which is a field that takes an engineering approach to kind of building out biotechnology tools. And there's been a lot of discussion there about open source sharing, because ultimately, if you're building up these kind of biological tools, you need the whole sort of a fundamental part of the field is that you effectively use DNA like Lego blocks. So you kind of have bits of DNA that have different functions and you can string them together. As we all know, biology is far more complicated than that, but that's effectively a kind of good model for how synthetic biology works. And you run into challenges if each of those individual pieces is, you know, fully protected, patented and locked down, because it makes it very challenging. The transaction costs are very high for producing the devices and products kind of further up the chain, which are actually where the value lies. So not in these kind of foundational enabling technologies, but in the kind of the later points. And so again, it's that balance of when do you make something open? When is that going to lead to the greatest impact and benefits? And when do you have to keep it back because you need the investment, because you need the funding to actually move stuff forward? And so I kind of in this milieu of sorts of different ideas and things going on. Again, going back to Simon's point about realizing where your unique value is, I sort of sat at the corner of a sort of conjunction of a bunch of different communities. And it seemed that really for a lot of my colleagues in Latin America and Africa, a major challenge they were seeing was in access and supply chain for reagents. And we've really seen that kind of, everybody knows this now post-COVID, right? So 3 years ago, it was less of a kind of talked about issue. Now that we've all experienced the reagent supply chain issues of the last 18 months. But this is kind of day to day for the majority of researchers operating in Africa and Latin America, long wait times, cold chain issues, overpricing because of the number of distributor steps. And so it just seemed like we could do something around a local and distributed manufacturing model, borrowing some of these kind of like open hardware, 3D printing type of models, and look at, can we support smaller businesses to really just service the market that's around them? So you cut out the supply chain holdups because there's no shipping. You can, you know, formulate reagents and enzymes that don't need cold chain shipment, for example. And you're also building up a local business. And so the question was really whether that business model would work. Can you sell enough enzymes and reagents and other things to support yourself? And so we set out to do a pilot with a group in Cameroon who I already knew from this sort of open technology community. We set up a lab, we started manufacturing, and we've now got a full-time team of 5 out in Cameroon who are making basic molecular biology reagents, buffers, enzymes, PCR master mixes, this kind of thing, and also acting as distributors. Obviously, we're not making everything. So we also have a network of suppliers, mostly independent, smaller companies that we've sourced to kind of provide other reagents where, you know, we try and kind of provide a really affordable price for the researchers. And the experience has been not straightforward by any means, but we're looking that the business will be sustainable by the end of this year in Cameroon. And so that's now where we're trying to apply that model to other places. But I think the strength of that model is really thinking about, like, how do those businesses, which are independent businesses, locally owned by local scientists, how do they benefit from being part of a network and having some centralized support? And so I'm really interested in governance structures and kind of how people set themselves up. And I'm really interested, like Simon's kind of dichotomy of, well, we need funding, but we also need to deliver benefit to people. And how people address that problem is really interesting and exciting. Like, the people are coming up with all sorts of models. And so our model is basically that we have a not-for-profit that sits in the UK and provides some initial technical support for these companies to set up. But over time, we'd like that the UK arm so takes a back seat, and that there's enough capacity built up in these local nodes that they can support each other, distribute some of the R&D effort that small companies struggle with. If you look at what small companies struggle with, you can't afford a full-time accountant, you can't afford a full-time lawyer, you can't afford a full-time marketing team, you can't afford to do every single piece of R&D yourself often. And so by kind of spreading that load across a number of companies in different places that are effectively doing the same thing and needing the same services, that's basically what we're aiming for. I'd say we haven't proved that model yet, but Cameroon has been a kind of positive starting point. And it's really just thinking about value and like where it lies and sort of who holds value at different parts of the chain and how you can really make that work together. I'm really interested in how you combine those pieces.
Wow. Well, I've never heard of this model. This is the first time hearing about it. And I'm just interested in knowing what does Simon and what do you think about this is it open, what did you call it? Open source IP?
Well, so again, going back to value, we don't think that our value is actually in the invention and IP of the products, because actually primarily what we're producing was invented quite some time ago. In fact, such a long time ago that the patents have now expired. So we have, which is good, we have total freedom to operate in terms of producing those things. Also, the fact that a lot of inventions were never patented in the countries that we're operating. So in effect, we can actually use them because, a lot of people don't realize that patents expire. So once they're expired, that technology is free to the world. And a lot of people also don't realize that if someone hasn't patented in your country, so for example, we're operating in Cameroon, the majority of biotechnologies were never patented in Cameroon. So we're free to manufacture and sell them as long as we don't export them to a country where it is patented. So I think there's a lot of scope for scientists in places of the world where things are not frequently patented to take advantage of that.
Yeah. So, just moving on with this, I was just curious to know what Douglas thinks about, this model. Is this something that you've applied or applying in Malawi or where you are?
Thanks, Alice. And it's the open source model. I think it's taken hold quite a bit now. And it's not just small businesses that are looking at this, but also big businesses appreciate that, not all the know-how that they need actually sits within the organization. So are more willing to sort of interact with other creators of knowledge. So Jenny's model is an interesting one. And I think it addresses a key sort of challenge in an African setting. So I find the IP itself is not always the issue. It's not really always the real issue when we say we've got problems in Africa. Jenny's pointed out just one of the points is most of the time the IP is not protected or is not filed in your country, so you're actually free to use it. But what Jenny transferred to Cameroon and is looking to transfer, I guess, to other regions is the technical know-how and really leveraging whatever resources are available in your context and using those because, as she pointed out, it reduces a lot of the cost. I think the discussion that's been happening around vaccines sort of talks to the same. It's not so much that, the cost of IP is high, but the capability to make vaccines still needs to be developed in Africa. And there's now activity obviously going on to develop the capability of making vaccines. But I think the industry you're going into usually determines your intellectual property strategy. And Jenny rightly pointed out that, you can go into certain spaces and not have to worry about intellectual property because the industry, for one, might not actually find intellectual property a requirement. And so for me, that allowing the access or the local access is critical. And I think Simon's business model based on, so talking around distribution is the fact that they are an online, you can access their offering online means it doesn't matter where you are. Means his logistical issues are slightly different to a company, for example, that's trying to produce enzymes in Africa, having to import a whole lot of things. There's definitely a need to work around the business models. And like Jenny, I'm very interested in the models because we always assume that there's one way to do things. But I think it's really important to look at how do we deliver the value we want in the context that we are in a way, work around whatever the barriers are or the challenges are, which is essentially what Jenny's been doing with her model. And it'll be very interesting to see how it works out. For example, for me, the not-for-profit organization that sits in the UK, when it steps back, or even at this point in time, is the Cameroon entity, for example, commercially viable? I think she said it'll be commercially viable by the end of this year, hopefully. And is it a for-profit organization? Because, even if you're a not-for-profit organization, it doesn't mean you don't make a profit. It just...
No. I always say not-for-profit does not mean we're also not for loss.
Yeah, that's right.
As well.
So not-for-profit doesn't mean you shouldn't make a profit. In fact, all non-profits should make a profit. The question is what happens to that profit? that changes what that organization's philosophy, etc. is. So yeah, for me, Jenny's model, very interesting, and I think has huge potential and can be applied to several other type of innovations in Africa, where the open source approach is really useful.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, that's obviously going, deeper into this language that I think a lot of us researchers would probably find quite alien, but I think it's still good to know that there are people who can look after you. If you're a researcher, there are people like Douglas, there are people like Jenny, and of course, people who have experienced the whole process like Simon, who can actually help you to understand some of these things. And I just want to, just go back to Simon and talk a little bit, just a little bit about some of the challenges, like maybe just give us like 2 or 3 major challenges or roadblocks when you felt like giving up or this is, I'm not taking this anymore.
Is that today or over the course of
Well, yeah, just a couple today.
Yeah, no. So, I think our biggest challenge by far has been intellectual property. We kind of spoke about it there, that Doug pointed out that the intellectual property was not owned by ourselves, but was owned by the university. But if you're spinning out a company and you need to raise funding, you need to have some way of owning or at least licensing your IP, and preferably a lot of the investors prefer that the company owns the IP. And South Africa and, a lot of kind of African countries, to my understanding at least, and Doug will have more insight on this, it's a very nascent space. So, for example, the university just had no experience, had no understanding of IP or of spin-out companies or anything like this. So if you go to, MIT or Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford, the TTO there is a plan. If you are going to spin out a company, there's normally a couple of options that you can choose, whether, and the IP just gets assigned. But for us, it was almost a 4-year process from when we understood and realized that we needed to get the IP assigned to actually having the IP assigned. And unfortunately, during that time or prior to that time, Doug had moved on. And so I think that was one of our challenges, that there wasn't a continuity across the technology transfer office. But honestly, Doug described me as determined, and I think I lost my determination multiple times during that. That for me was going to be the breaking of the company. And there were days where we thought that was it. Through no fault of our own, the company was not going to survive. So that's probably the biggest challenge. But happily, in August 2020, so we're just a year over, that we finalized the assignment of the IP from the university to actually a holding company, but to the company. And so we now own our IP. So that's probably the biggest challenge. And then the second biggest challenge is trying to make a company or keep a company going and growing and sustainable in a time where you can't raise funding because you don't own your IP. So a 4-year process that started with a full head of hair and ended with no hair as a result of all of the stress. But yeah, I think trying to keep the company going during that time and keep the eye on the prize and remember that we're doing this for a reason, and let's not give up. But doesn't mean there wasn't days where one didn't want to give up. But yeah, they were probably the 2 biggest challenges we had. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And I'm also curious to know, like in your work, Douglas and Jenny, do you feel there isn't adequate support in a lot of the research institutions and universities? If at all there's any support.
Well, I've been very fortunate. I mean, Cambridge, it has a very well established and very well experienced tech transfer office, and also takes quite a selective view, so they don't, for example, patent everything. They actually, if you look at the amount of research funding that comes to Cambridge versus the number of patents that we make, it's far, far lower than the US universities, and they're quite apparently, according to some certain members of Cambridge Enterprise, really annoys academics who come to them like, this is my amazing thing and you should want to patent it, and they're like, no, we're not patenting it. So they're quite nuanced about how they address these things. So I was fortunate, but I think also a benefit of being here is that we do have these other options. So I mentioned that kind of, that my model is certainly somewhat different to the sort of standard course thing that you get taught on a biotech enterprise course. But we also have a Centre for Social Innovation at the Judge Business School here. We have the Centre for Global Equality, which is a charity that kind of supports social enterprises and particularly technology-focused social enterprises. So I'm extremely fortunate. But having said that, we definitely have seen the kind of challenges at other institutions in terms of really struggles to get IP kind of transferred, and the understanding and the nascent nature of some of the technology transfer offices that Simon mentioned. I want to say, it was interesting to hear the challenges, because I think it reflects our physically having to ship stuff versus software challenges are quite different. And again, the open source thing, when you have a piece of software that's effectively a zero cost to reproduce it and kind of get access to it, how you structure your intellectual property in your business model, if you're trying to insert open source into that, it does work. And there's a lot of examples of it working, but it's also quite challenging. If you're trying to sell someone a physical thing, they do not expect to get it for free. And so, if we're shipping enzymes to a lab, they're not expecting that to turn up without having paid for it. And so I always say, if you're working, regardless of the IP status of the technology, if you're working in hardware or stuff you're physically sending to people, you have to sell it for more than it costs you to make it. And effectively, that's kind of your business model, but it's actually somewhat simpler. And you're really then looking at brand and kind of marketing and reaching the right people. So I think for us, the challenges we've had are moving money around is a nightmare, particularly between Cameroon and the UK, for example, and other places. A lot of our customers want to pay on mobile money, and we want them to pay on mobile money because we think that's the kind of value add that we can give, but that presents challenges. Physically shipping stuff around is a pain, particularly customs and import tariffs. And I've heard this. I'm also working on a working group around local manufacturing of diagnostics that was started through a UN initiative. And we've run a number of workshops, and that's what we hear from local manufacturers of diagnostics a lot, is importation, customs, tariffs, etc. So those are probably two of our major issues that we struggle with, and getting into customers as well.
Okay. And what about so I know that, Douglas, you're working in Malawi and a couple of other countries at the moment. What are some of those challenges that the researchers would face in this?
Yeah, and so Simon was right that, the IP landscape or IP regulatory framework and landscape in African countries is still developing. South Africa, only in 2010, I think, the Intellectual Property Rights Act came into force and required all universities to establish tech transfer offices, including those who had never had tech transfer office. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from internationally, and then saying, what works for a South African or for an African context. Is Cambridge Enterprise has been going, I think, for a long time. I was about to say 150 years. I'm trying to remember the last sort of news I heard from them. But they've been going for a long time. So the approach for me as a tech transfer office to intellectual property, I like Cambridge Enterprise's approach, is really get it out there. As IP has no value sitting in a research institution or in a thesis in a library. There's obviously the value of the publication, but we can actually augment or increase that value by getting it out into either social or economic markets that can actually create more value from it. So it was painful to hear of Simon's process to try and get IP assigned, and many reasons, including inexperience and, just the lack of understanding or universities actually trying to, I guess for me, push the envelope in the sense of get as much as they can out of this, and not appreciating the fact that the most value from IP is always going to be made in the market or in society, not at the institution. And so even if we license our IP for 5% royalty, the 95% value that's created is not going to come back to the university. It sits in the economy. And that's where it should be. And so I think institutions in Africa and everywhere need to learn this concept of get the IP out and make it as easy as possible to do that transaction. The other challenges African countries have is we don't have the same access to finance. While I'm not saying there's no money, because there is a lot of money, access is a different thing. I think there are times Simon, in fact, turned away finance because, the conditions around this finance were essentially unacceptable. I was going to use the word ridiculous, but it's unacceptable. And it's again trying to understand that we're in an environment where we need to make it as easy as possible to create new businesses or to get our market offerings out there. is rather than, trying to create requirements, regulations, rules that aren't applicable in our context. And so that's always, for me, been a big challenge is, make it easy to move IP out of the university or know-how out of the university. Make it easy to access funding. Appreciating what stage of development the development of the opportunity is. So when Simon was at the start, it made no sense when people were trying to sort of say, well, we'll have 51% of your company. Or, so that sort of approach. And it's all, for me, a matter of time and experience and learning that hopefully as I go around running workshops on IP and tech innovation and entrepreneurship, the message goes out that in order to grow this ecosystem, we need to make it as easy as possible to interact, for the ecosystem actors to interact and do business.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I like this idea, where you're talking about actually laying out the role of institutions in helping, working with the academics, the researchers to go through this process. So that's why I was wondering if that kind of support, I mean, from the time that I worked in the university, I didn't even know where the office was, where I would have learned, is there an opportunity for me to do something or to translate anything? What is the process? Who's in charge? Who is going to lead? Who's going to help me? Who's going to hold my hand? And I think this applies to a lot of researchers. I don't think that it's visible, it's obvious for researchers to know, one, there is that opportunity. Two, like you said, a lot of the IP is sitting there in theses and libraries and so forth, and it's not being translated. Do people actually know that? And so I don't know what your views are, but you're just expanding on the role of institutions in developing the helping to develop or translate a lot of the knowledge and transfer.
When I was in academia, there were kind of, I guess, three metrics that we as academics were held up against. And one was how much funding you bring in. Two was how many students you graduate. And three was how many papers you publish. And really, they were the three metrics that we were held up against. And, innovation or anything out in entrepreneurship or IP or anything like that just wasn't even thought about. And it just wasn't considered. And so as academics, we were under so much pressure to bring in money, graduate students and write papers that the thoughts of then going, well, actually, there's this whole other thing that I need to focus on around kind of innovation and entrepreneurship, it just wasn't there. It wasn't there in any of my colleagues, whether in Ireland or in South Africa. It wasn't in our mindset or our focus. And I think that was probably driven from an institutional level. And Jenny, I'm sure you're going to say that in Cambridge, it's probably different from that because there is that history around the institution being aware of it. And so I think at an institutional level, informing people and also that PhD students, know that there's another option. There's almost this journey you follow, right? And I followed that traditional journey of undergrad, PhD, postdoc, and then you have to get a tenured professorship somewhere or whatever. But there are other avenues that we can go down. I think it's just marketing that and people knowing that exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to try and bring us back to, each of you have these very important roles in the research community, be it promoting or starting companies and that kind of stuff, or promoting entrepreneurship and so forth, and supporting and developing. I just want to hear from each of you one or two tips that you would give researchers who would like to explore or are interested in entrepreneurial opportunities.
I'd probably say number one is to go back to the point both Simon and I made in ours, that think about what you're uniquely placed to do. Like, what do you feel you have the drive to do? Because something has got to sustain you through the 4 years of trying to wrestle IP out of someone else's hands, and all the issues with banks not setting up your account correctly, and like all of this, there's sort of the day-to-day is challenging. And I'm still a full-time researcher as well. So I have a team that kind of, fortunately, that manages a lot of this stuff now, but it's still really hard. So you have to have that, really think hard about what drives you. I mean, I had a fellowship from a South African philanthropic foundation called the Shuttleworth Foundation, so that they try and pick people who would be doing the work anyway, whether or not they got the money, by giving them the money. And it's usually driven by a sense of injustice or a kind of anger towards something that's wrong in the world that we have to fix. So I'd say figure out what you have to fix and kind of stick with that. And the second thing I say, do not underestimate people. And I think as researchers, we know this, right? It's not just about the research project you're doing. It's about your group environment and your PI and how you get along with them and kind of like what kind of culture you enjoy working in. And I've worked in kind of groups and cultures that I didn't enjoy so much. And now I've found groups and cultures that are much more aligned with my personal values and kind of how I like to do what I do. And so I'd say if you're moving into setting up a business, try and align yourself and find people out there who have set up their businesses with the same sets of values. It may be a totally different product, but they're trying to do something similar or make a change in a similar geography. And you kind of feel like that you have some alignment in terms of your ultimate aims and goals. And I think try and seek those people out and really talk to them, because those are probably the people that are also going to be your support network and also your advisors as you move through. And I think that it's not necessarily that they're in the same sector. I mean, as I mentioned, my company is in biotech, but both our ultimate kind of aim and the way we're going about it are very different. So I wouldn't necessarily cluster with people in biotech, but I might find people in software or in kind of engineering who are trying things. And it's more about that kind of like culture and way you're thinking and approaching the problem rather than the problem that you're trying to solve sometimes. So yeah, those would be my two tips.
Wow. Okay. And Douglas, do you have any tips?
Yeah, so mine would be whether you're a PhD student, research student, or you're a researcher. If you ever come to a point where you think you've got an idea or the results, outcomes that you've achieved you feel strongly that they have the potential to actually create value, talk to somebody who can help you to actually evaluate that. Because again, for me, is the reason, for example, Cambridge Enterprise or the Tech Transfer Office at Cambridge, and I would say no to a lot of opportunities, is because they usually don't address a really compelling need. And that's usually one of the first things you look at. And both Simon and Jenny's sort of offerings are addressing real key needs. That's always the first part. And I think institutions are very keen to put innovation and entrepreneurship in their strategic documents. And I think they need to take a step further and rise to that challenge and actually provide the environment for researchers and students to actually be able to explore that a bit more, whether it's by providing more capacity building or training or support structures for those discussions around those concepts, because I think there'll always be a learning period. And for me, the key roles of universities are knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. And one of those routes for dissemination is transfer them to market. Like Simon said, it actually isn't one of their KPIs. So why would they do it? Why would they focus on it? Unless you actually gave them the time and the resources and the support to do it.
Yeah. And Simon?
Yeah, so I think mine are probably tips to my old self, but it probably applies to everybody. But I think the key one is that it's not just about the product. Historically, with my academic hat on, I guess, it was always focused on make this better, make this the best. How can I improve the sensitivity, accuracy, or whatever? But actually, business and commercial is such a much bigger picture than the product. And I think we naively in the early days thought, we'll just build it and then everyone will come. But actually, whatever that movie might say, build it and they will come is not necessarily true. There's a whole other kind of amount of work that you have to do around that. And I think related to that, my second one would be is, if you are going for a profit-based or moving to sustainability-based approach, you need to understand the business model. You need to understand where you sit in the value chain and how you access the user, how you access the customer, and how you make money. Because without that, you're just not going to survive.
All right. So you've heard from the mentors of today. So I think this has really been great. And this is a mentorship podcast. So we hope that, people who are listening have picked up very important tips. And I'm pretty sure that just having that awareness, as a researcher, is the start to, trying to find the help you need, trying to find if it's training that you need, if it's, mentorship that you need. This is definitely an area an alternative career route, right? Where, you might actually want to start thinking about. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion and giving us all these tips and giving our audiences a chance to learn, about how researchers can and should really be embracing entrepreneurship and the role that institutions should be playing in making it happen. I'm just going to ask you to share with our listeners where they can find you on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I'll just start with Simon.
Yes, so my Twitter handle is @Simon_Trav, TRAV. And you can go to www.hyraxbio.com and everything's there.
And Jenny?
I'm at Jenny_Malloy, MOLLOY, and my research group is at openbioeconomy.org, and my nonprofit is at beneficial.bio.
And finally, Douglas.
Easiest way to get hold of me is on LinkedIn. Search for Douglas Sanyahumbi. That should come up.
And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Please follow us on Twitter at mentor_podcast, where we will let you know when we have new episodes that are being released. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud just by searching for Your Digital Mentor Podcast. You can also reach us by email. So please send your comments and questions to inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. As always, we'll have information on the episode and how to reach us will be in the description box, including how to connect with our guests and also links to more information and resources. And finally, our goal is for this podcast to be shared as a resource. So please remember to tell people about us. And so thank you and see you again in 2 weeks.
This episode is supported by Advanced Courses and Scientific Conferences, a program which develops and delivers training and conferences that span basic research, cutting-edge biomedicine, and application of genomics in healthcare. Through engaging and networking, the events educate, inspire, and transform careers worldwide.
This episode is also supported by the Wellcome Sanger Institute. It undertakes large-scale research that forms the foundations of knowledge in biology and medicine. It uses the power of genome sequencing to understand and harness the information in DNA. The Sanger's discoveries are used to improve health and to understand life on Earth.